Good. Good evening, everybody.
Going backwards. I'll explain it.
See, I don't need to begin to introduce myself here. I'm here to introduce our speaker for tonight. It's a great pleasure, Axel Posluszny, who all of you, I think, already know for sure, because he's been around here for 2 months now as a visiting scholar who's come here through the exchange that exists between the DAI, the American Institute of Archaeology, and the DAI, the German Archaeological Institute. Axel comes here actually with a double specialization. And for that reason as well, he has been giving 2 talks here during his stay. His one specialization is remote sensing, and he spoke about that on the Brownback that he did last month here. And geophysics was a big part of that. That's what he spoke about. But also LiDAR is something he's really one of the scholars leading the field there. And he spoke about that in a specific dedicated workshop as part of our skills class last Friday. And it's worth mentioning under this heading of remote sensing his technical specialization, so to say, that he currently, since recently, chairs the steering committee of the CAA, the Computer Applications in Archaeology. But Axel's other specialization is Iron Age archaeology of Central Europe, roughly of Germany, and then Iron Age in the broad sense. So it's Iron Age in the first millennium BC, but also Iron Age extending into the later period, the sort of late antique, early medieval, the so-called, which at one point were called the Germanic Iron Ages. I don't think that's a term that's very widely used anymore, but at least that's what I think is Eckert's term. But anyway, that's not the point here. What is the point here? That the Iron Age, that is what Axel will be speaking about here. And before I turn over to him, I'll just, for your information, will add that he was trained at the universities of Bonn and Marburg, where he did his PhD, and worked for a long time at the DAI, the German Archaeological Institute, specifically for the Römisch-Germanische Kommission, which is really the sort of the Roman Iron Age department, so to say. And within that organization, he was the PI and coordinator of the large EU-funded Archaeolandscapes projects, which ran between 2010 and 2005. But at present, as you can see on this slide here, not long before coming here, he actually changed jobs and switched the DAI for the Glauberg, or Kaltenberg am Glauberg, and you will hear much more about the Glauberg tonight, but where he is now the research center at the site and the museum of what's called basically the archaeological part of the Kaltenwelt, as we will see much more in detail. So with that, Axel, over to you for the talk about the princely sites, landscapes, and a view for a while.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody for coming and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of my older work that I've been doing and some of my recent things that I'm currently doing and that I will hopefully be able to do in the future. My talk today is on a specific phenomenon in Germany, Eastern France and Western Bohemia that we call Fürstensitze, or princely sites, Celtic princely sites. I will show you some examples because probably they are not well known to everybody here in the room. And I will show some of the analysis that I have been doing with these sites in a project some years ago. And I will focus mainly, of course, as I'm working now for the Glauberg Research Center, on the work that I have been doing on the Glauberg itself. So I will start with the question, what is a Fürstensitz, or what is a Celtic princely site or princely seat? These so-called Fürstensitze are a very well discussed phenomenon in German archaeology, well discussed not in the sense that the discussion is over and there's a solution to it, but still people are fighting over it. And I'm not going into the details of that fight. I will focus mainly on the Glauberg and on the landscape archaeological aspects of my GIS analysis, and will also tell you a bit more about the recent work that we're doing there. When we talk about the era of the Celtic princely sites in continental Europe, we talk about the period of roughly 600 to 250 BC. As I said, there is a long-lasting discussion, and that was fostered by an article from Wolfgang Kimmig in 1969, where he kind of tried to define what a Celtic princely site is from his point of view. So one of the aspects is a fortification, another the position on an outstanding hillside. There should be Mediterranean import goods, and last but not least, there should be large grave mounds and outstanding finds of the nobility living on the Fürstensitz nearby. And Kimmig and his disciples not only gave a definition of the term Fürstensitze, they also tried to interpret that kind of settlements as central places inhabited by a reigning nobility, having the power and the wealth to participate in a system of long-distance contact to Italy, Greece, and southern France. And that all sounds like the term Fürstensitz as well, a little bit like a medieval image of a society. My main focus today, as I said, will be on the Glauberg, so allow me to introduce you to this site. You will hear a number of theories about the Glauberg and the reason why it is probably extraordinarily important or had been extraordinarily important in the past. Some of them supporting each other, some other of them rather contradictory. So what I'm going to show you in the next minutes are first of all the main facts we know so far, and finally my, I have to confess, unproven theory about some of the facts and the features of that site. The first fortified occupation after an unfortified Neolithic phase on the Glauberg started around 1000 BC with an unfortified only small, to a small part, fortified Bronze Age settlement, followed by a first fully fortified plateau in the early Iron Age late Hallstatt period, beginning around 600 BC. The period of the princely importance on the Glauberg, however, is dated to the early Iron Age, early Latine period, starting about 460 BC. The hill fort itself has a plateau, 8 hectares wide, which had been fortified in that period. Another 12 hectares have been fortified by a rampart and ditch to incorporate a spring in the north of the plateau. That's the blue dot that you can see there. And the whole area is surrounded by another rampart ditch system, which is only known to a small extent by now, but covers at least an area of 206 hectares. Though I have to mention that this rampart system was never completed, which will play a role in my interpretation a little later. This drawing, therefore, is just meant to make the general layout a little clearer. Part of this fortified, or at least demarcated area, is one small and one larger grave mound, the latter being situated in the center of a ditch system that we call Procession Road or Prozessionsstraße. So we don't know if there was any kind of procession going on there at all. It's just simply a long stretch, and that looks like a road, and people could have used it for procession. With its still visible ramparts, mainly surrounding the plateau, the Glauberg was of course a place that attracted researchers rather early, so it comes to no surprise that first excavations or first regular digs started in 1912. The first major excavation, and marked here in green on the plan below, were carried out in the 1930s by Heinrich Richter, who, due to lack of money, was seeking the financial and organizational support by various Nazi organizations of that time. His excavations have been rather intense, but unfortunately, first of all, he didn't write much about it, and second, a group of German SS soldiers tried to win the war in the last days of the war, attacking US soldiers passing by. The result was that the depot with all the finds, with all the documentation, burned down totally. So there's just a handful of stuff that survived this because it was stored elsewhere during that period. The state archaeologist of Hesse at that time, Fritz Rudolf Hermann, then started new excavations from 1985 to 1998, and these trenches are marked here in red, and his main focus was the dating of the various phases of the rampart system. My colleague Holger Beitinger was able to decipher the at least 5 phases of the rampart or wall based on these excavations in 2010. So mainly important is phase 1 and 2, the walls from the 6th and from the 5th century BC, erected as so-called Pfostenschlitzmauer of the Altkönig Preist type, something you don't have to remember, but I have to mention it because every German has to mention it when he talks about these things, which is a double-walled construction with timber frames and a backfilled ramp on its inner side. The 5.5 meter wide wall number 1 dates back to the Hallstatt, so the first phase of the early Iron Age, and was destroyed in a fire in the late 6th century BC. This fire was so hot that many of the stones melted, so that's one of these vitrified forts that we have examples for all over Europe, especially also in Scotland. And it was replaced by the nearly identical wall number 2 in the 5th century BC, early Latin period, and then we have an early medieval and 2 medieval phases following these ramparts. The finds, and I'll show you just a few of them here, are standard finds that you can find more or less on each early Iron Age settlement, with loads of pottery and just a small amount of metal finds. But these finds that you can see here, they are a little more extraordinary, and they brought the focus of archaeologists to the Glauberg, thinking about this place not being one of many fortified hill forts, but something probably with a little bit more status or higher status. On the left-hand side, you see the remains of an Etruscan bronze vessel handle that was found some 20 kilometers north of the Glauberg, but in that area we don't have any hill forts, so the nearest hill fort where a connection could be made is the Glauberg. So this Etruscan import good was somehow related to the Glauberg. And on the right-hand side, you see part of a necklace which has an artistic style which is said to be Persian. In any case, it's not the typical Celtic style that we're used to have in our area, and that was found directly on the slopes of the Glauberg. Unfortunately, it's not known exactly where that was because it was already in 1900. Nevertheless, people were thinking, okay, this is an important site, but they were still looking for the burial mounds. As I said, Kimmich said there is, to these princely sites, you also have to have the princely burials. And in 1987, an amateur archaeologist discovered on an image, and that's the one on the upper left that you can see here, this structure that I now highlight in red, which is a ditch, part of a ditch system, which was then excavated from 1994 onwards. And it turned out to be a totally flattened burial mound. And its center, where you usually would expect the burial, they found an empty pit. Most likely not a plundered grave, but a pit that never contained a burial or anything else. So maybe something to just trick the looters that were, of course, active already in the early Iron Age. But 2 other features could then be discovered which contained the remains of 2 very rich burials, and those are the ones marked in red on the little map on the lower left. The first grave contained all those things that we needed to make it a Fürstengrab, a princely burial. The gold fragments, a bronze flagon, a so-called Schnabelkanne, and moreover organic material like wood, cloth and leather that made clear that this grave was not only extraordinarily wealthy but also a fantastic source of information for us archaeologists. I will show you some of the finds a little later, but of course you can also see them when you all come to the Glauberg Museum. We are one of the very few museums that really has the original finds on the site itself, so that's very outstanding. The excavators decided to cut the whole grave out of the surrounding soil as a single block, which was then brought to the labs and excavated there over a longer time period, and that gave us much more information, of course, on the finds in that block or in that grave than we would have gotten from any excavation out in the field, because it really took 3 or 4 years of excavation in the labs. And then on 24th June of 1996, my colleagues found what could only be described as a sensation. It was a life-size stone statue of a Celtic warrior lying in one of the ditches around the burial mound. And I will come back to that guy a little later. All these discoveries led to a very large-scale magnetic survey of 250 hectares, which is roughly 618 acres. At that time, one of the largest surveyed archaeological areas worldwide, and still one of the biggest. And apart from a number of pits and ramparts, amongst them those that I was talking about earlier, this survey data revealed another small ring ditch with a burial pits in its center. That's highlighted here in red now. Again, this burial was recovered as a block and excavated in the lab. So we can have a closer look at the finds from the 3 graves that are now on display in the museum. Grave 1 from Tumulus 1 contained the skeleton of a 21 to 28-year-old person, most likely a man, 1.69 meters tall, with a shield, a golden neck ring, arm ring, finger ring, various fibula, a sword, spear and arrowheads, a belt and an iron wire, which was the remains of a rather unusual headdress or cap, which I can come back to later. A bronze flagon, the so-called Schnabelkanne, a typical Celtic-style variant of the Etruscan Schnabelkanne, was found in the southeastern corner of the burial chamber, and it was wrapped in cloth and contained honey wine or meat. Burial number 2 in the same tumulus was a cremation in a wooden tray placed in a smaller pit. The burial contained the ashes of a 30 to 40-year-old man with an iron sword, 4 spearheads, a richly decorated belt, and a bronze fibula with coral pearls. And also this grave had a bronze flagon, this time a so-called Röhrenkanne, again with the remains of honey wine in it. There are only 2 similar flagons known to this one from Celtic burials, which are fully preserved. One is from Rheinheim in the Saarland area, and the other one from Waldalgesheim in the Rhineland area. So again, something very outstanding compared to the burials that we know from other places in Europe. And finally, grave 3, the only grave in that smaller tumulus, number 2, contained a tree trunk coffin of a 16 to 20-year-old man with a golden arm and a golden finger ring, shoe trimmings, a leather belt with a sword, a spearhead, a small gold layer bronze fibula, and a 10.5 centimeter large bronze double mask fibula with 109 coral inlays. Again, something very, very rich and very prestigious. One fact seems to be important to mention here. All the 3 graves contained grave goods, which make us think that they were burials of warriors with weapons, as well as with golden items, which then could possibly be interpreted as signs of a specific social status, because something like a golden arm ring is an item you don't usually find in a Celtic burial unless it is a very, very rich and outstanding one. And at this point, I would like to come back to the aforementioned life-size stone statue of a warrior that was found in a ditch. This is, of course, not the only statue that we found during the excavations. Another 130 fragments from at least 3 more statues have also been discovered in the ditches, which look very similar to the complete one. You can see these, some of these fragments there on the lower left. We do not know if the statues were buried intentionally, like the remains of the 3 warriors, or if they were destroyed, the more or less complete one broken from its bases, and then slipped into the then still half-open ditches. We also do not know who is represented in the statue or on the 4 statues. Was it a symbol for the most powerful person from the Glauberg, a personification of a specific person, or of a warrior or of a leading person as such? Why at least 4 statues? Why is one nearly preserved while the others are intentionally destroyed? Do the statues represent symbols of political power, of religious power, of a combination of both heroes, druids, chiefs, warriors? Or do they simply represent individuals, the individuals from the graves without referring to their rank and status in society, but as individuals? One thing, however, seems to be important to mention. all the main features of the statue can be found in grave 1 in Tumulus 1. The sword with a similar handle and a similar shape of the scabbard, the shield, a golden finger ring, a single arm ring, golden in the grave, and 3 additional bronze arm rings, a golden neck ring with 3 extensions, and last but not least, the funny Mickey Mouse style cap, which in the grave could be identified by an iron wire and remains of leather and wood. Unfortunately, the remains of the other 3 statues are too badly preserved to be able to detect similar features, either similar to the first statue or similar to one of the other graves. So you now have seen why archaeologists and myself as well think that the Glauberg is a very special place with more than a regular meaning. We could discuss the term Fürstensitze here and wouldn't be able to finish this discussion until next week, probably only because we were tired, and that's what would be the only end of the discussion. So let's not talk about the term itself, but I would like to focus on other ideas related to the importance of the Glauberg and similar places in Germany, and that brings me to the work that I've been doing for a research program that was funded by the German Research Foundation from 2004 to 2010, dealing with these Fürstensitze, and I was investigating them from a landscape archaeological point of view. So first thing is, how do we think a settlement hierarchy for the early Iron Age could have looked like? What role might the Fürstensitze then have played in such a system? Eike Gringmuth-Dalme described a system which was based on medieval societies and the kinds of functions settlements could have had at that time, and that's what is represented here in this image. It is a model where we could see a princely site on the top of a pyramid with other settlements with lesser functions being inferior or even tributary. The question is if we can see such a system in our archaeological record and if such a system can be transferred to the early Iron Age in Central Europe. On the one hand, I have strong doubts that it is possible in general to find archaeological traces of all the different functions that you can see here in a settlement due to methodological restrictions. On the other hand, even if we could find archaeological evidence for aspects like religion, administration, and so on, it seems still too simple to reconstruct Iron Age settlement system as a pyramid, while it seems far more likely that a network of places with different functions, with different meanings, and with different relationships among each other, and on an interregional level describes the historical situation in the mid of the first millennium BC much better. And we have talked about the prominent location of the Fürstensitz that Kimmich mentioned in his definition of the Fürstensitze. So I did one very simple test, because one might argue that the Glauberg itself, as one of the mountains situated between the fertile Loess region of the Wetterau area and the foothills of the Vogelsberg Massif, that's the brown spot on the upper right-hand side of each map, is outstanding enough to work as a place mark, a feature in the landscape which helps orientating when approaching it, and therefore a trading post or marketplace. So I have calculated the cumulative viewshed from all settlement sites of the Hallstatt period, the transitional Hallstatt early Latin period, and the early Latin period, both with a maximum view of 10, which is the upper row, and 20 kilometers. And in both cases, the visibility of the Glauberg from its contemporary settlements is near to 0. And it's obvious that the Glauberg was not a far visible place with its inhabited landscape, at least not for the people who lived there at the same time when the Glauberg had its importance as a princely site. Of course, when approaching the Glauberg from the direct vicinity, it really looks impressive and dominant, but obviously this prominence is a matter of distance or a matter of scale. There is the idea of the Glauberg being a trading point, very well connected to the surrounding areas, and that could be the reason, the economic wealth related to that could be the reason for political and social power that the mountain or the people living there might have had. We know from the finds of the Glauberg settlement and its grave that there were connections, of course, between the people living here and people, for example, in the middle range mountain areas to the north and in the Hunsrück region in the southwest. But is the Glauberg situated in a way that it would be an ideal stopping point or distribution or marketplace? Standard least cost path analysis shows us that the Glauberg, marked here as a red star, is not situated on one of these modeled routes. What you can see here is the result of the least cost path based solely on the slope as cost, connecting areas of the distribution of a specific kind of pottery. Steep areas are avoided, which is what we would expect when choosing a route for larger trading purposes. This is where the consideration started to question the results of traditional route reconstructions, which differ quite obviously from those of the GIS modeling, as I will show you later. One main argument for using flatland routes, and that's essentially what my calculated model says, is the problem of crossing rivers and streams and swampy areas in these landscapes. Instead, the use of hilltop paths is recommended as a possibility to avoid swampy areas in the floodplains of rivers, being the main flatland area available for routes. But we have very clear evidence for the use of bridges crossing both rivers and swampy areas, and I'll show you two examples. One on the left-hand side from the later Iron Age area in Switzerland, and then on the right-hand side, that's an early Iron Age swamp bridge in northern Bavaria. And a wooden bridge that was found just 55 kilometers north of the Glauberg is something that you can see here on this image just a few years ago. And these sites show that it is rather likely to model routes also in areas that people think are not very suitable for transport because they are too swampy, there are too many rivers to cross. Of course, and that's probably not really a surprise. People in the Iron Age were clever enough to build bridges who can do things like you've seen in the metalworks on the images, is probably able to build a few bridges as well. So it's rather likely that the modeled routes, even if they don't represent really actual prehistoric roads, describe the accessibility, and that's what I want to say with it, of the Glauberg quite well when being based on the avoidance of steep slopes as the major path of transportation, which then again makes it not really, from my point of view, likely that the Glauberg has its importance due to the fact that it was a trading place. So still the question remains, what made this place so special? Part of the princely side of the Glauberg is the ditch rampart system surrounding the plateau, with the main settlement. I have mentioned this earlier. Remember the gappy rampart ditch system around the hill. You can see part of the ditches here on the LiDAR scan marked in green, and newer ones that we just discovered on the LiDAR scan in red. And the blue arrow indicates a reconstructed grave mound on the southern flank of the hill fall. And that, for me, probably means that on the one hand, the layout of the surrounding ditch system includes the rich burial mound, here marked in blue, into the settlement area and places it into the sphere of the living. On the other hand, the ditch system includes the burial mound as well, placing it extramuros, which is the usual way people were buried in that period, into the sphere of the dead. The rampart ditch system shows a double use and perception, both of space and of borders. The enclosed area is incomplete and permeable. It allows entering both the sphere of the living and of the dead. And this visualization shows quite clearly the incompleteness of the surrounding rampart ditch system, here in blue. It can be by no means have served as a fortification. It consists of several sections which might not have been constructed at the same time. So it might be possible, and that's where my, let's say, storytelling begins, that these fractions of the surrounding enclosure have been dug and erected at some kind of social activity where people from surrounding villages and communities came together at specific dates to work together and to celebrate feeding and feasting activities to strengthen the corporate feeling of the society that belonged to the sphere of the Glauberg. The idea of seasonal meetings with social activities, common working, feeding and feasting might relate to a number of extraordinary features that have been discovered during the excavations of the burial mound. This arrangement of ditches and especially posts could have been a complicated and well-constructed system which can be interpreted as a calendar building, enabling people to measure time, seasons, and also longer periods as it is related to the southern moon standstill, which occurs every 18.6 years. And it's something that we find in other archaeological sites as well, including Hopewell structures here in northern America. It is not unlikely that this might have been the reason for the significance of certain people with a knowledge about time, who also made the Glauberg an exceptional site, which might have been important for people from far away, even farther than the direct hinterland of the settlement itself. The construction of such a complex mathematical and astronomical system could only be done with a certain degree of knowledge that is based on the work of generations of people, which we might call priests, druids, or whatever. The knowledge, especially the knowledge of time, is something that might be the source of power, and therefore someone who had this knowledge and lived and worked on the Glauberg might have been the basis for the central role of the whole Glauberg settlement. Centrality and the importance of a site is often seen as related to a dense population, or at least a higher density of settlement sites around the central place. This is strongly related to economic factors. A very dense site distribution shows that the main factors for successful economic activities have been met, whilst gaps might show a lack of one or more basic resources. In the eastern Wetterau region, with the Glauberg hill fort in its center, the number of settlements from the late Bronze Age Urnfield culture, here marked in green, period is larger than from the early Iron Age Hallstatt period, red, but the populated areas are nearly the same, what we can understand as a thinning out of settlements, not as a shifting. The Glauberg Fürstensitz is situated at the periphery of the core settlement areas and pretty much close to an area of very sparse population. It did obviously not play a role as a crystallization point for further settlement activities. A potential economic gain from trading, as proposed by colleagues who see the Glauberg as an important trading point, is not visible in the sense that it attracted many more people to settle in the Glauberg vicinity. In a different area that I was working on as well, Mainfranken, northern Bavaria, situation looks a little bit different. The area around the Marienberg princely site, we see a much more scattered settlement density, both in the late Bronze and the early Iron Age. The densely occupied areas are significantly increasing in the early Iron Age, and as about 60% of the core settlement areas of the late Bronze and the early Iron Age differ, we can understand this as a shifting, using large areas that have been used in the late Bronze Age, while at the same time adding so far less used areas as well. The Fürstensitz of the Marienberg has been occupied in both periods, and it seems as if the areas around became a little more occupied in the early Iron Age, which would correspond with my idea of the Marienberg's importance being based on its role as a trading point situated directly on the important River Main. So thinking about centrality in the territory of each central place, we might wonder how such a territory looked like. Was it based on economic reasons, like the distribution of pollen that have been found in the meat from the Bronze Age flagon from Grave 1? This meat, or the honey from which it was produced, was interpreted as a tribute to the Glauberg prince, and the distribution of the plants that produced this pollen was therefore taken as a territory of the Glauberg prince. Unfortunately, things are not that easy. The evidence is based on today's plant distribution, and we don't know at all if that reflects the distribution some 2,500 years ago. Moreover, even if the honey was brought from as far as 150 kilometers, this does not mean it could only have been a tribute. It could also have been a trading or an exchange good. Probably a territory or surrounding area of interest or influence was not only or not at all based on economic reasons. Maybe such an area, or at least for a Fürstensitz, was also defined in a somewhat more perceptional way. The viewshed around the Glauberg shown here in green is of course depending on the terrain, so no wonder it matches in many areas with a least cost-based border calculated on the basis of the slopes. But more important is the fact that most of the burial mounds, those are the tiny triangles that you hopefully can see on the map as well, in the vicinity of the Glauberg, though most of them are not dated yet, do lie more or less exactly at the border of the visible zone around the Fürstensitz, demarcating the area that is under control from the Glauberg. In this case, we do not see an economically defined hinterland, but an area that is marked by the grace of the ancestors. The central meaning that the princely sites might have played in their time and for their territories might have resulted in a central layout of these sites within the landscape. The problem is that we do have very little knowledge about the territories that might have belonged to a Fürstensitz. We don't know how large they were, on what the layout was based, and we don't even know if there was a political territory for each Fürstensitz. For the later Iron Age, the era of the large Celtic oppida, which Caesar and others have described, we know from the work of Peter Jude that at least in the area of the upper Rhine Valley between Baden-Württemberg and Switzerland, which is the very southern part of the Celtic distribution there, the military control of an area was handled from places near the border of territories and of macrocore regions, while the settlement with a central meaning in a social or more general way must not be visible as such in the archaeological record. Caesar, for example, mentioned Celtic chiefs that lived and also controlled their tribe from their home village, which often was by no means a large oppidum. If the same is true for the early Iron Age is of course not clear. A border situation, and that's what I want to show with a map on the left-hand side, on the other hand, can be defined in different ways. There might be political, cultural, or ethnical borders. There are also macrocore borders that are based on the natural environment. In some cases, these different borders might have had the same localization, while in others they might have been totally different. And the princely sites in southern Germany are always placed close to these macrocore borders or to large rivers, which also might have functioned as borders or at least as separators or as passages. I would like to interpret that as a hint that the Fürstensitze might have had a central meaning, but not a central position within their landscape. It was the position close to the borders or to passages that was important, be it for trading purposes or for other reasons. Natural borders are more or less static, while the settlement dynamics from the late Bronze to the early Iron Age is reflecting changing social or political as well as cultural borders, so that I would say that at least in this prehistoric periods, environmental-based regions are not the same as political territories. Being responsible for the research on and around the Glauberg will allow me to develop research strategies for the future investigations that will hopefully help to answer some of the remaining questions. Now, a lot of remaining questions, as you might imagine. I've already shown you the large-scale magnetic survey that was carried out between 1994 and 2001. Unfortunately, the state heritage archaeologist at that time decided that he only would like to have an image of the geomagnetic data, which means the State Heritage Service doesn't have the real data. One of the first things that I did when I started my job is getting in touch with the company who did the survey there. They still have their data in the archives. The problem is that it's data from 7 years of work, having been done with different machines, different file formats. So they currently are working on homogenizing this data so that probably by the end of this year I will have these 250 hectares of real data, and that will be a fantastic source for further planning my work on that site. One strategy to understand the various features that we can see in this magnetic data, and there are really lots of them, is of course field walking and looking for finds that help us to date these features. I mentioned the Glauberg has been settled starting with the Neolithic time until the medieval period, so there's a lot of things going on which might not be related to the Iron Age. We do our surveys both on the traditional field working way and with metal detector surveys. Sometimes this reveals a beer bottle cap from not so long ago, but sometimes we are a little more lucky. What I show you here on the left-hand side image is a bronze object that my colleague just found 2 weeks ago. You are the first ones that have the pleasure to see this find. I haven't seen all sides of it, so I only know this image. So I don't really know what it is, but it could be a part of a belt or a horse gear or something similar. What is most striking about it is the similarity of the style of this bronze object with the fibula from grave number 1 from the Glauberg. It looks as if they both might have been made in the same workshop even. We will of course try to find out if there are any buried features related to that find, and I will try to dig there in one of the coming years if I get the money for it. We have been talking about the burial mounds as potential territorial markers, but even with that possible meaning they are important features, and or even without that possible meaning they are important features to understand the prehistoric usage of the landscape. The project that I've been working on during my visit here at Brown University was the further investigation of the landscapes around the Glauberg with the help of LiDAR data, adding also historical images which are stored in the US National Archives. So I will present you two examples of the work that I've been doing. The first one is a group of newly discovered burial mounds some 5 kilometers or 3 miles northeast of the Glauberg. The image here shows the area with those mounds that we already know or new, and marked here in green is the general area, and that's the main information that we got of the mounds. The exact number, however, was not recorded in the files that I have available. Marked in red here are the single mounds from the known burial areas, and further west the newly discovered mounds. Not many of them, but still there are more mounds there, and one would wonder if there's a connection between these two sites or if these are independently erected. The same area here again with a different LiDAR visualization, which probably makes it a little bit easier to spot all the features there. One might think that burial mounds of 2 to 20 meters radius or probably even diameter might easily escape our notice, but larger archaeological objects like hill forts should be known so far, especially in places that are not too remote, like this spot here next to a motorway. So if we digitally remove the forest to see what's underneath it, we are able to see the remains of so far unknown and currently undated hill fort with 2 lines of rampart, more easily visible here in this trend removal visualization. And I've also marked the remains of 3 burial mounds on the foothill in red. And as some of you might know, I've spent a week at the National Archives Department in College Park in Maryland. I had the chance to search for historic aerial images of the US Air Force taken between 1945 and 62, and was able to find more than 300 images. So the red lines mark the outlines of the image that cover the area that were registered in the archive to have been taken by the Air Force in the wider area of the Glauberg. I've also been looking for the images of other research areas that I'm dealing with, and I found out that the area around the Glauberg was the area with by far the most aerial images being taken compared to even urban places like the city of Wiesbaden. The Glauberg is marked here with a red dot, and you can see that it is an area with a very high flight and image density. I don't think it has to do with the Glauberg being a princely site. Probably that's not what the American soldiers knew about, but still there is something related to it. During my visit at Nara, I was able to scan 83 images, both vertical author images as well as oblique views. And currently, I'm trying to georeference the images, which is not so very easy because the landscape has changed quite a bit, to prepare the further research. My aim is both to search for the images for unknown archaeological structures, for known structures in order to monitor their development over time, and to also understand the changes that the landscapes and the villages in the vicinity were undergoing during the last 50 to 70 years. But not only these old images from more than 50 years ago reveal new insights. A number of aerial images were taken during the excavations in the 1990s, and one of them shows this strange linear structure with some kind of rectangular compartments to it, which are barely visible in the magnetic data. Probably you are able to see it, but it's very difficult to see. Not sure if I can filter more when I get the real data from that spot. What this is, I have absolutely no idea, but that's on the list of things to find out. So we probably start some coring there with the help of the colleagues from the German Archaeological Institute who have a 5 centimeters core equipment. We can just get there, get our measurements and do the coring and see if there is something in that structure that helps us to understand it. So of course, to answer some of our questions, we still have to excavate. And well, why not? It's good fun anyway. The geomagnetic survey is a great basis for us to formulate questions and to find spots that have the potential to answer these questions when we excavate there. Unfortunately, geomagnetics does not work very well on the plateau due to the basaltic bedrock. We will therefore have a georadar survey in late April on the plateau to prepare for this year's summer academy with students from England, Netherlands and Germany, where we hope to find remains of a medieval church that should have existed on the plateau, which in the Middle Age was the place of a small but very important town. We also proceed excavating the cellar of one of the medieval houses of the town that we started excavating last year. My main focus for the excavation this year will, however, be on the south slope of the Glauberg, not too far away from the re-erected main burial mound and the so-called procession road. I've already told you about the gappy rampart ditch system that surrounds at least parts of the hill. And if we zoom in our geophysical survey, you can see the main ditch highlighted in dark blue, the corresponding rampart in pale blue, and another ditch system cutting through or being cut by that rampart shown here in yellow. We plan a trench, which is marked here in red, to be excavated in May, hoping to be able to solve the relative, possibly also the absolute dating of that smaller yellow ditch, which presumably is of early Neolithic age, but it shines through the Iron Age rampart quite substantially. If this ditch really is of Neolithic dating, is a question, and why it was placed on that spot very close to an area that some 5,000 or 5,500 years later became a ritually used burial place with yet another ditch structure. As the geomagnetic data also seems to indicate that the Iron Age rampart has an internal structuring, we hope to reveal insight into the way it was built and to find out if it even had a wall inside and not just a pile of mud. The stone statues of the Glauberg are of course amongst our most distinct features. They are the best preserved and most detailed depiction of a Celtic warrior, priest or whatever that have ever been found in Europe. So far we have done analysis to find out where the sandstone came from that was used by the Celtic stonemason, and we are very sure that it came from no more than 5 kilometers or 3 miles away. What we do not know is if the statues have originally been painted. Spanish statues of roughly the same period are more or less all painted, very brightly painted, very beautifully painted. We will have a team of chemists from Frankfurt University coming to the Glauberg once I'm back, and we'll hope to find traces they can analyze to help us answering this question. What I don't really know is how good this statue was cleaned after the excavation. We know that from the fragments, they have been very, very intensely cleaned, so there's nothing on it left. One of the guys who was at the excavation some 20 years ago told me that it was not the case with the statue itself. So we have no idea if there are remains. We will just simply try. We have also organized a number of other scientific investigations dealing with the quality and the source of the iron salts, with strontium analysis of burials in the vicinity of the Glauberg to be compared with the results from our burials and many others more. With a hill of that size, with so many features, finds, structures and data and questions, we are sure that we will have enough work ahead of us for the next 50 years or so, and such a big workload cannot be completed by 1.5 men team, which we are currently. Similar places like the Mont Beuvray or the Mont Lassois in France have solved the problem of big workload by inviting a consortium of international partners to collaborate in the future research. I will talk to the colleagues there and also to some of the partners from these consortia to learn from their experience before setting up a similar system. The idea is not to share the workload only, but also to gain from different experiences, backgrounds and expertise. So let me conclude. The final map shows the diachronic dynamic of settlements in the different regions, where we have landscapes with very different amounts of settlements from 3 different phases. Green, the late Bronze Age, red, the first phase of the early Iron Age, and blue, the second phase of the early Iron Age. This is, of course, a very clear indication for the overall dynamics of what is going on in the late Bronze and the early Iron Age in southern Germany. coming back to our primary questions of centralization processes and of patterns of social development, we now know that the situation in the Hallstatt and early Latin period is much more complex than we have thought it to be based on the simple model that Wolfgang Kimmich presented in 1969. Do we really see an early urbanization on the Fürstensitz phenomenon just because some places seem to become richer and seem to get a more elaborated structure for at least a while? 6 years of research of several projects working together in this research program have brought new insights and a new evaluation of the role of those specific hill forts. The more or less simple hierarchic model of Kimmich and others has changed into the understanding that we cannot lump the princely sites together. Every site might have had a different basis for its growth and its importance, be it trade and the exploitation of resources, be it a surplus of agricultural economy, or be it the role as a center for cult and religion, like, for example, the Glauberg, or be it a combination of more than one factor. The cultural and the environmental background in the early Iron Age societies have been the ideal general framework for the emergence of hill forts with a somewhat superior meaning. All the projects of the research program have altogether created a much more differentiated picture of the Fürstensitze. We don't have a single cause for the centralization process, and we still do not have answers to all questions concerning those princely sites. But maybe that would have been asking too much. With these words, I would like to thank the German Research Foundation for funding me during this research program from 2004 to 2010, the Rome Germanic Commission, where I was working for some 15 years, for all sorts of institutional support, the colleagues, of course, of the research program, CAA for constant inspiration, sometimes including beers as well, the Archaeological Institute of America, of course, for funding my visiting scholarship here, and of course, the Tchaikovsky Institute for hosting and supporting me here. And with this final image of the Glauberg and the museum, I would like to all invite you to come and visit me there, have a look at the site, have a look at the wonderful finds that we have there, and discuss things about princely sites, and if you want, we can do that with the help of a glass of Scottish single malt whiskey in my office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel, for a great talk and a wonderful invitation.
I'm not paying for the flights.
No, but there's plenty of us who travel around Europe, so I think you might find takers for the invitation. In the more immediate future, any questions or comments for Axel?
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I think the work that you're doing is really, I hope you can hear me, revolutionized the understanding of the Iron Age, and particularly the transition between the early and late Iron Age in this period. And on that, I had a comment and then also a question. The question I'll put first, which is about that. The traditional model was that these major Hallstatt Fürstensitze had disappeared at the end of the Hallstatt period, and then you saw the emergence of these warrior elite burials on the periphery of that former area. So in areas like the Maun and Dürnberg in Austria. And I'm wondering, since the Glauberg seems to be on the northern periphery of the former distribution, if that's a manifestation of that same pattern, although the grave itself and the site look in many ways a lot more like the older Hallstatt pattern than they do like the other ones that are around.
Yeah, there are significant differences to the Hallstatt graves. In most of the Hallstatt graves, you find far more things that are related to the idea of feeding and feasting. You find sets of pottery or of bronze plates and vessels for drinking purposes and feeding purposes, which are made for a larger group, while in this case you only find one big flagon. 4 liters is quite a lot, but you never know how thirsty these guys were. So there was at least some symbol for this kind of things visible in the graves, but it was not the manifestation with lots and plenty of things to host people in a feeding and feasting process. So yeah, I think there's some reason to still think that this is a peripheral aftermath or something.
The observation I had, which was just very quick, was in relation to you're showing how many of these sites, most of them actually, seem to be in relation to some kind of a boundary, whether it's rivers or some other boundary form. And I was just struck by that, the fact that in the research that I've done in Africa, it's precisely on the boundaries between different tribal groups that you find the location of major markets, because those are the most secure zones for people to exchange. So neither group has to travel into the territory of the other.
Yeah.
And it could make a lot of sense in terms of finding these places as sort of communal sites where you have activities, including trade and exchange taking place.
That's the one side that I think plays a role, but the other thing is also a simple economic reason. You minimize the danger of the economic loss if you have access to regions with different landscape settings. So you can grow different crops, or you can go into forest for hunting, or you can go and looking for nuts and all sorts of things. So this kind of different landscape that you can include into your economic system makes sense, of course, also from an economical point of view. I have done some analysis on the surrounding of old settlement sites in the areas and the potential, let's say, least cost path areas around it based on walking speed and walking distance. And it turned out that 2 hours distance would always overlap with the next settlement. So something that, if we refer to Bindlev and others, would probably, let's say, the market distance or something like that is then would be 2 hours walking, but that was probably not really the sphere of economic work of a settlement. That's far too large. So that seems to be smaller, and if you go into the 20 minutes walk, which is probably rather likely if you want to go to your field and work there every day for at least some month, then there is very, very little overlap. And there's, of course, these time periods spent over something like 100 or 150 years. It can be that this overlap is simply due to the reason that one of the villages didn't exist while the other was there, and the other way around as well. So there is obviously something economic in it, but also I'm pretty sure there is also some social thing behind it. Avoiding too much trouble with the neighbors, but still being in touch with them. I think that's a very human behavior in general.
Yes, please.
Is there any evidence at all of from the burning layer of the wall, what the possible causes of that were, destruction or violence?
No, these vitrified faults have been heavily discussed. Still, some people think that they were burned intentionally to strengthen the structure, because it really vitrifies and it's melting together. But that's only part of it. Other parts of the wall become totally crumbly and fall apart. So from my point of view, that doesn't really make sense. So far, the let's say most believable explanation is that you have these wooden structures inside the wall, and if that burns, there's some kind of chimney effect causing. You got holes and the air is floating through, and also you got cold and cold there, and it's kind of long burning inside these walls. That could have caused that, and we know from some sites that the same effect not only causes this melting of the rock, but also a calcification of the rock. So if you got limestone, that wouldn't melt. It just turns into calcite. Is that the right word? I think so. The white stuff. So it is obviously something that happened in many regions, more or less causing a total destruction of the site. But nobody knows why that happened. For sure, they were not smoking there. But you never know if it was an attack. We don't have any reason to believe there was an attack. It could have been, but it could just simply been a fire that went out of control.
I was really struck by the range of imported objects that were found in the graves that you were talking about, and I was wondering if you could firstly say a little bit more maybe about the role that these imported objects were playing in the society, and secondly, whether you find objects from this area kind of travelling outside as well?
Yeah. Well, first of all, most of these imported goods are found in southwestern German, Hallstatt, Fürstensitze, and it's very often pottery, which is somehow related to drinking things. So there are vessels for importing either wine or olive oil, and there is obviously some reason to believe that it was not only wine that they transported, but also olive oil. But that's currently under investigation. I hope to find out more about the new results on a conference in 3 weeks' time. And they also have drinking vessels. And that's Greek pottery brought from Marseille. Some stuff is coming from northern Italy as well, Bucharest pottery. That's usually the main stuff that we find here. On the Glauberg, there's nothing of that. When Kimmich had his wonderful idea of the Fürstensitz, there had always had to be some Greek pottery there. The site of the Marienberg that I showed you, I've written my PhD about it, and I broke my head into pieces to find out where the bloody, the rampart is. There is one, but it's not datable. So it could also be medieval. And the site itself, it's a rather tiny place, but they found a handful of Greek pottery there in Würzburg, which is northern Bavaria. And they did an excavation due to construction things just 2 years ago and found more of that Greek pottery. While on the Glauberg, we don't have any of that. What we have from medieval periods on the Glauberg is a color that was used to dye the cloth there, which is made from this little leeks, that was formerly used to color your Campari. I can't remember the name of the animals. Anyway, and that comes obviously from the Mediterranean area as well. So that is the main stuff. Sometimes you find bronze work as well. The 2 bronze flagons from the Glauberg graves are Celtic variations of these bronze flagons that usually come from Etruscan areas. They look totally different, so it's very visible this is a Celtic thing. They wanted these bronze flagons, found out it's a nice thing to have, but we want them our style. And that's why they are very distinctive in their nature. The bronze handle from the Etruscan vessel that I showed at the beginning of my talk, we have absolutely no idea why it was there. I'm still trying to find out where exactly it was found. So what I know, it was found 1935 when they built a little airstrip preparing for the war. And at the place where the airstrip now is, there is a settlement area, so there's not much likeliness to find any archaeological features there. Otherwise, I would go there with a magnetic device and look for graves, because that's something that you would probably find in graves. That's not what you usually find in settlements. And this strange Persian-style necklace, no idea. I wish I would know where exactly it came from. Because again, then I would look into my geophys data, is the spot there, and would go there and the next year and would dig. Because you don't have something like a bronze ring with Persian ornaments or Persian style on it in the vicinity of Frankfurt, so to say, just to throw it in your garbage pit. It's something special. But what that means for the context is very difficult to say. We know that the people on the Glauberg had long-lasting contacts. Or as early as in the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, we find contacts. We've got a shoe vessel of pottery in the Urnfield period, which is probably relating this part of the world to Bohemia. So there were trading contacts. And that's always the argument when I discuss with my colleagues about the role of the Glauberg as a trading point and as the accessibility on natural routes or naturally given routes. They always say, yeah, you got all the contacts. And yeah, sure. Every settlement was not just there. It doesn't pop up. People build it, and they were connected with their surrounding. we are in an area where people were talking to each other, were trading with each other, were doing things with each other. So of course, every site is connected with each other in a different, difficult network probably, but still. So of course, also the Glauberg was part of a trading system, sure. But from my point, it's not the ideal place to start your business, so to say.
Any other questions, comments? Yes.
So following up on that, since we've been looking at this map and it's making me notice the Glauberg is seems to be on the sort of northern peripheries of the distribution map of the princely sites. So, I mean, do you think the absence of things like Greek pottery from the Glauberg is just because they're further from the sources of supply at Marseille and Italy? Number one. Number two, if you go beyond Glauberg, further to the north, are there late Hallstatt, Latin period hill forts that are, you know, big and impressive in the landscape, but lack that sort of top tier of fancy stuff that is the reason you classify a site as a, you know, frozen sits in the first place?
Yeah. So for question number one, which was?
It's so far north.
Okay, yeah. No, I don't think it has to do with the distance. It seems to be it seems to have to do with the habit that the tradition changed. That at that time, and we're talking about a phase which is the second phase of the early Iron Age, after the Hallstatt period, it was not fashionable any longer to have this stuff in the sites. So most of that material from Greece, and especially these decorated red and black figured pottery, is found in Hallstatt period sites. Of course, some of the red figures are in some early Iron Age, early Latin period sites as well. But the main bulk, obviously, is in the Hallstatt period. So it's probably a matter of simply of fashion. That's the one thing. North of the Glauberg, there are more hill forts, quite impressive ones as well, but none of them has that status. This might be just our knowledge now because we haven't found the burial mounds to it. Because if we wouldn't have the burial mounds on the Glauberg, it would still be, okay, a very impressive, nice hill fort. There is some Persian stuff there, but yeah, who knows? But there are not really these extraordinary finds that we have in the burials there. And so probably if we dig some of the so far undated burial mounds in the vicinity of other hill forts, that could also change. What is a little bit difficult in that respect is the fact that a little north of the Glauberg, let's say 100 kilometers north or something, the culture more or less changed. We've got a cultural divide in Germany, cutting it into North and South Germany, which is visible from the Neolithic onwards. They have different kind of Neolithic cultures up in the north than we have in the south. Different kind of Bronze Age cultures, different kind of Iron Age cultures. So there's really a difference there, and still people nowadays are different. No, it's true. They really are. We've got different dialects, we've got different behaviors. So that's the middle range mountain areas is some kind of, I wouldn't say barrier, but it's a cultural divide in a way. I don't know how much this might have influenced the situation there as well, but clearly we don't have any evidence for any of the very rich sites north of that middle range mountain areas. Okay, there are not too many mountains there, so it's not very likely to find hill forts. Like in the Netherlands. So probably the lack of hill forts, of princely sites in the Netherlands is simply due to the lack of Dutch mountains.
There's one princely burial in Stockholm near the central region.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, okay. So it's obviously, if people are rich and have a higher status, they express it in a different way.
Yeah. There's one near all.
Yeah, probably.
There's also an interesting theory about Frisian, well, Platanas, I don't know what you call them in English, but it's like mud brick kind of construction.
Yeah.
Very peripheral, but elaborate for the time. We use what we have.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
But
But I think at this point we're getting into finer details. So I think we might move on here to other finer details of a glass of wine. And thank Axel for this talk. Thank you.